Hello, everyone, and welcome to my office. I apologize for the half glasses on, half glasses off look that I've got going on today. I know there's a glare. It's just hard for me to read off of the syllabus while I'm also trying to see what's going on the camera. So my apologies for that, but I want to make sure that I get to everything from this week and last week that you've been reading or will be reading, whichever way you're doing it. So I'm going to keep track on my syllabus, hopefully follow that pretty much to the letter as far as the chronology is concerned, and we'll catch up from my computer mishaps and vacation or July 4th and all that other stuff, okay? So let's get started. We left off with the end of the Renaissance, or I'm sorry, the end of the medieval period. We're moving into the beginning of the Renaissance period. During this time period, it's a little bit confusing as we move into what we call the modern era. So if you think about it, the medieval period, these dark ages, which you can imagine as sort of dark, I mean, I do, and then Renaissances, which of course mean rebirth, moving through all of those in Europe, in not just continental Europe, but throughout the world. Honestly, there were multiple Renaissances going on, but we pay attention mostly in Western civilization to the ones that occur in Europe for scientific enlightenment. And so we sort of, come out of the Dark Ages very slowly, geographically speaking, very slowly. We go through learning more about different philosophies and ideas about why we're on the earth, how we communicate on the earth, why we're here, and how to produce scientific versus artistic evidence. And that is what starts to happen during the Renaissances. And that is what moves us into what we call the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment can be seen as sort of the opposite of what was going on during the Dark Ages, which just kind of makes sense, right? We know that during the Dark Ages, rhetoric was seen as evil for a multitude of reasons, but we also know that there was no scientific progress during that. Depending on who you talk to, 400 to 1200 years of time. Which if you look at recorded history, that is can be close to or over half of our written history that we really know anything about. So it's sort of a big chunk of our time that we said, hey, wait, we're moving too quickly, we're finding out too much, we're learning too much, we need to slow down. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, no progress got made that way. So as we get into the Renaissances, these rebirths that, people begin to question the Bible. They begin to question the idea of one God. They try to question particularly Christianity, which, was something that wasn't allowable during the Dark Ages, at least not in Europe. We move further into not just questioning that, we then have to question, well, what does truth mean then? So during the Renaissances into the Enlightenment, we really have a tension that grows between rhetoric, the aesthetic or the artistic, the nice and pretty things, and the scientific, science, and what that means, which back then, just to be clear, scientific discovery did not really occur through as much instrumental, investigation and things. We weren't using microscopes yet. We weren't using, obviously electron microscopes or understand the, atomic nature of our world. None of that was happening. So when we talk about science, we're talking about making truth or finding truth through observation and then reasoning. So a lot of times during this period, reasoning and science sort of become interchangeable, if you will. Almost exactly the same thing in a lot of cases. So I just want to make you aware of that, because as we go through this today, we're going to be sort of hearkening back to that general principle and that tension between art and reasoning and rhetoric, okay? So one of the biggest questions that comes up is, what is the role of rhetoric during this time period, okay? During the time of the Renaissances and during that turn, we see a couple of things happen. For example, Christine de Pizan, she writes about how women are allowed to speak in the church, I'm sorry, that's a different person. Christine de Pizan talks about how women can move through the ranks, right? She addresses her work to the princesses. So how is it that the princesses can make things happen in the world based on the fact that they're really, rather than princesses, think about it more as courtiers, sort of the women who hung out in the royal court, okay? And she gives us a very clear footprint or a very clear map of how to move within those ranks as a woman. And she does this in both the City of Ladies and the Treasury of the City of Ladies. And in those books, she says that the most important thing a woman has at this time is her reputation. Excuse me. What do I mean by that? Well, her virtue, her virginity, her purity. That is the most important thing for women to protect during this time period, because that was the only way they gained credibility, really, was by how pious and pure they were. So she talks about the most important thing for a woman is her reputation. Then we have a really quick turnaround, a sort of 180, and we have Peter Ramus. And Ramus is important for a lot of reasons, not just because he's kind of fun to read, because he likes to say things like, if you've ever seen the movie The Princess Bride, where Vizzini said, have you ever met Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle? And the man in black says, yes. He goes, morons, right? And Ramus is doing this exact same thing. And this is problematic for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's sort of undercutting the foundations of the educational system at the time, to say that those people we rely on, those philosophers who tell us what the truth is or tell us how to find the truth, to say that they are morons, that they, I don't even remember all the words that Ramus uses specifically. Moron comes to mind, but I know he didn't use that word specifically, but sort of calls them dumb and stupid and says they didn't know what they were talking about, and then tries to lay that out. And he gets particularly jumpy with Quintilian. And one of the reasons why he gets jumpy I'm sorry, it wasn't Quintilian really, it was Cicero. No, I think it was Quintilian, where he gets jumpy about the way that Quintilian defines rhetoric, because he says it's ridiculous that during the Roman period, people felt that you should have to be a good person who speaks well. He said that's ludicrous. That is bleeding together art and science, and those two don't belong together. He says instead that the 5 canons of rhetoric, remember, foundational principles for education, those 5 canons should be divided up. And depending on which interpretation of Ramus you read, I want to say that your book says that the only thing that rhetoric should concern itself with is delivery and with style, right? So sort of the artistic side of rhetoric. Your book may include memory in there as well, memoria. I don't recall, but I've heard that interpretation. However, for me, the way it gets divided really is that, yes, style and delivery are in rhetoric, but he also argues that the other 3, which would be obviously invention, arrangement, and memory, belong to not the art of rhetoric, but to reason. All right, so Ramus comes out, he says, God gave us 2 gifts, speech and reason, and we should not confuse the 2. He believed that rhetoric confuses the 2, mainly because Cicero and Quintilian brought in the idea of an ethic into the concept of practicing rhetoric. And he said, that's ridiculous. That's like asking a painter to write a poem and evaluating him on his poetry rather than on his or her art. Or paintings, or their art or paintings, and that evaluation, somehow they're a terrible painter because they can't write a poem. Okay, that's, to me, kind of silly, but that's Ramus's argument. And so what happened to Ramus when he made this argument? He was basically run out on rails, out of town. And as you know, he died, if you read him already, he died in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. So yeah, he was literally run out of the town on rails because he believed this. And it didn't end well for him, actually. Ramus is a very interesting character. If you ever get interested, which, you know, most of us don't unless we're getting PhDs in this stuff, if you ever get interested, reading Peter Ramus's history is kind of interesting. So that's what he contributes. He contributes this division in the canons because he believes that reason and the artistic should be completely separated. And this is where rhetoric gets its bad name. Rhetoric is nothing but style and empty language, just lies sometimes. So he really takes on that Platonistic idea that rhetoric is bad. And from then on, rhetoric got a bad name. And so whenever somebody says to me, oh, rhetoric is just a bunch of flowery, empty language, I say, sure, if you're living during the time of Peter Ramus, that is true, I guess, for him at least. But it sort of kept that reputation throughout time, unfortunately. Okay, so how do we get out of this debate then, or this tension between these three things? How do we get out of that? Along comes the Enlightenment, and what is in the Enlightenment except that we start to have insights into things. We're not just questioning the foundational principles that exist in rhetoric and in education. We're now questioning how we find the truth and how we can do better at learning. And so we start off, I start off for you with Bacon, not Kevin, the other one. Sir Francis Bacon, who's, believe it or not, his mom's maiden name was Cook. So his full name is actually Sir Francis Cook Bacon, which I find hilarious. Anyway, he writes two pieces that we read, and that's the Advancement of Learning and the Novum Organum. And in the Advancement of Learning, we really just get a sense of his idea of faculty psychology. And here he's laying out that you may have a faculty, a skill, if you will, for math, for science, for biology, for understanding the natural world. Rhetoric is also included there. So if you were born without the gift of rhetoric, then you would never be able to have it. Now, that might sound a little bit familiar coming from the Roman period, but Cicero says it's not impossible to become a good speaker if you aren't born with that talent. He says that it's harder to become a good speaker if you're born without that talent. And that's true for everything, right? I probably could do math, but I never really honed that talent. The last time I took a math class was when I took advanced trigonometry when I was in the 11th grade. Like literally, that's the last time I took a math class. Is that good? No, I'm not advocating for that. What I'm saying is I can barely balance a checkbook. That is definitely not good. If I had just taken the time to learn more about how math works, I might be able to be a little bit more self-sufficient in that arena, right? Same thing here. If you're terrible at public speaking, at making good arguments, at reasoning, you should be able to hone that skill. And everybody should, according to Bacon and according to the original thinking about education. One of those R's that you learn about, reading, writing, arithmetic, none of which start with, well, reading starts with an R, but that's the only one. Reading, writing, and arithmetic, they also had rhetoric in there. And they removed it during this time period. It became a little bit considered, I don't know what the word is. It was considered lower class to take classes in rhetoric. It was considered to be something that was not valued. But Bacon does actually say, well, you know, rhetoric's important to understanding science. It's not just about how we divide the brain up and what faculties you were born with and which faculties you were not born with. This is about honing those skills and practice and being able to interpret and therefore being able to communicate them properly. Because science doesn't do any good unless you can communicate it to others, right? So Bacon then writes the Novum Organum, which literally translates to new instrument. So what is the Novum Organum? Here he talks about a way of evaluating what we learn based on human limitations. Okay, we're all human, and therefore we have limitations based on just the fact that we're human, right? He calls it an idol. If you think about it in terms of false idols, things we idolize instead of, say, looking for something else, looking for the truth. Instead of looking for the truth, we believe that everything Kelly Clarkson says is truth, right? I'm obviously being extremely funny there, or at least exaggerating quite a bit. But you get the idea that we are tricked or manipulated into believing something that's not true because we're not bothering with the truth. And so this first idol that he talks about, the idol of the tribe, is based on the fact that we as humans have limitations. We're limited by time, space, how much we can see, how much we can hear, how much we can read, how quickly we can produce science, how much we can internalize that, what observational experiences we may possibly have in our lifetime. So we're limited just by being human. The next one that he talks about would be the idol of the cave, or the idol of the dead. What does he mean by that? Well, you know how we all have our own perspectives? I mean, people oftentimes make up a word called perspectival. Like, well, that's coming from your own perspectival, which is just not a word. It's definitely coming from my own perspective, though, right? What I have experienced, what is in my little den or my little cave. We have we've got quite a few rooms in my house that are designated for certain things. This one is a guest room that's also serving as my office right now. And so when I'm in this room, all I really think about is work. I'm not going to come down here to relax because I'm thinking about work. As opposed to our Zen room, where you just go to relax. You go to listen to music or to do yoga or whatever it is that you want to do to relax. That's for that room. So it's hard to do work in that room, and it's hard for me in this room to do yoga. It just wouldn't happen, or to meditate, right? Because I'm too busy thinking about work. These little caves or dens are things that we come from, are places that we come from. Just our personalities, what we've learned, what we've taken in individually, how our individual perspective impacts the way that we interpret the truth or the way that we reason. Then we have the idol of the theater. And the idol of the theater is really the idol of culture. We all live in a culture, an American culture with multiple subcultures within it. And therefore, I'm going to know more about some things and you're going to know more about some things. We form our truths based on not just our experience at this point, like in the cave, or on being human like the tribe, but we base it on what we've been taught by our families, by our particular religious choices, by our particular art preferences, by what we enjoy doing, what plays we've seen, what books we've read. All of those things inform your cultural experience, which he says can distract us from finding the truth. One of my favorite things about this particular idol is thinking about the book Chicken Soup for the Soul, which there's like all these books on chicken soup for meaning the cure for this particular thing. You know, how to, not necessarily cure it, but how to ease your soul or how to calm yourself down. Because when you get sick, when you have a cold, you get chicken soup, I think, chicken noodle soup. For, the everyday person. I don't remember what they're all, but this idea that chicken noodle soup solves everybody's problem. If you have a cold, if you need to soothe your soul, if you need to relax, if you're too busy, whatever it is, chicken soup solves it, right? And that idea that there's one cure or one sort of panacea for everything is ludicrous if we really think about it. But the idea of chicken soup being good for a cold, where did that come from? And we'll say, well, it's an old wives' tale. What do we mean by that? Well, we mean that people have told that story for a long time, that chicken soup somehow makes a cold go away or cures you of that ailment. That is completely untrue. However, the salt content in chicken soup does make you feel better. It also soothes, because it's hot, salty water, it soothes your throat So if you have a sore throat, it will actually calm that pain down or that scratchiness down. It also helps your temperature regulate in your system. It also has nutrients and it has protein, which give you energy. And then it also has some herbs in it, which can help clear out your sinuses. So is there a science behind that idea that chicken soup is good for you when you're sick? Yes, but we don't look at it that way. Nobody really wants to look at it that way because we know from our grandmothers or our mothers or whoever, our fathers, our brothers and sisters, that chicken soup solves all your problems in that regard, right? That can distract us from the truth or the reality of, well, certain parts of chicken soup can help certain ailments. And they don't cure them, they just help them. All right. So that's the idol of the I've just forgotten it. The idol of culture, if you will, or even of subculture. I come from, my family, I should say, historically comes from a mixed bag of Irish, English, Czechoslovakian, which was only a country for like 36 years, which means also Russian, German, Bavarian of all kinds, and then also Italy, particularly southern Italy, which is, where all the Sicilians are. So down there, and traditionally certain things make more sense than others, such as the idea of that gnocchi, which is a great Italian dish, should be made out of potatoes and cheese, not just cheese, not just potatoes. But other people with different experiences believe that it should be one or the other. Simple stuff like that we gain from just who we are, how we were raised, where we were raised, what we were taught, what was repeated to us over and over again. That's the idol of the theater. Last but not least is the idol of the marketplace. And what is that? What limitation does the marketplace put on us? Well, in the marketplace, there's a currency, right? You exchange money for a good, for example. In the marketplace, the currency is language. What language we choose to use will buy us persuasion. It will buy us truth-telling. It will buy us believability, credibility. And so language limits us because we only have so many words that we can use. We only are exposed to so many words that we can use. We're limited by time again, but also because the way that language works, or the way that it was built, was that it was arbitrarily assigned meaning, right? Words don't just appear to us. It's not like one day somebody went outside and a big piece of wood said, "I am a tree." That's not the way that worked. We pointed at it and decided the word for this is going to be tree. And that's true for all languages and how they developed. So that is, it limits our ability to see the truth. So these four idols that Bacon talks about limit our ability to see the truth. But if we know that's the case, then we can use that as a way to help us discover more truth. So if I know that I'm blocking out certain possible explanations for things based on my personal cultural experiences, then I can say, okay, if I remove myself from those personal cultural experiences for a second and take a look at this differently, what else can I learn? All right. So these four idols really become a new instrument for evaluating the truth that we learn and the reasoning that we do. I hope all of that made sense. I ran through those very, very quickly. And of course, my iPhone shut down, so I can't see what's next. Okay, great. The next person in the Enlightenment, and I do love talking about John Locke, L-O-C-K-E. And if you were a fan of the show Lost, which I was not, but if you were, you will know why that name is so important, John Locke. John Locke was a preacher. He talked about the social contract a lot, sort of how we agree to work in the world with each other. But one of the other things that he wrote about was language. Specifically, and I don't know why my phone keeps doing what it's doing, but it's sort of driving me a little nuts, and I apologize for that. I just want to make sure that I give you guys everything that you're supposed to get. John Locke really talks about language in terms of multiple meanings. So in his essay concerning human understanding, he says that, really, first off, there's two kinds of language. There is, I should say two kinds of communication. There's the communication and the meaning that I know I'm trying to get across to you, and there's the kind of meaning that you understand. And we know that there's not a direct relationship there. Part of the reason why there's not a direct relationship there is because that internal meaning to me as the speaker and the sort of external meaning of how you interpret that are two completely different things with arbitrariness in language. But that's not the only problem with language. He doesn't believe that it's arbitrary. He says there's 4 problems with language. The first problem is that many words can mean exactly the same thing. He's not wrong. His second problem with language is that it can have one word that has many, many meanings. Also true. Another problem is that there's no way a word in our language or a few words can encapsulate the complexity of a natural phenomenon. Not wrong. And then finally, his final problem with it is that it's arbitrarily assigned. There's no natural relationship between a word and the thing that it's describing. Be that a material thing or an emotion, concrete or abstract, it does not matter. And in that, he discovers or decides that there are 2 true meanings for words, or 2 true definitions for words, is how I should put this. The first definition is the way that we interpret the word or meaning of that word. As individuals, even as cultures, as subcultures, etc., the way we interpret that word is one kind of sort of definition of that word. The other definition of that word is the generally accepted and agreed upon definition of that word. Now, when you were in 5th or 6th grade, I don't even know when they're teaching this. I don't know if they're teaching this, so bear with me. If you've ever heard the words denotative and connotative meaning in language, then you might understand this a little bit better. Denotative, we're always told, means dictionary definition, and connotative always means contextual definition, but it's not as easy as that. Denotative actually doesn't just stand for the dictionary definition, although that's mostly the way that we get this, but it's about what words we agree upon having a certain meaning, okay? And that changes over time within subcultures, within cultures. There are a million examples I could use right now, but I'm just going to start with a few. The word bad. Before Michael Jackson, before the mid-'80s or the early '80s, the word bad meant that was not good. Okay, it was known in terms of not being good. It's bad, it's a negative. Once we started to go through time with it and people started going, that's so bad. We all had a hard time adjusting to, okay, that means good. Same thing happened to me in my 30s. I was talking to a class once and I said something about what I was doing that weekend, and a student said, oh, that's sick. And I was like, what are you talking about? That's not sick. It was a perfectly acceptable thing to do. And that's when I found out that that word actually meant it was cool or awesome or something along those lines. Other words such as bling. Bling was the word that was sort of onomatopoeia for what a telephone back in the old days would sound like. And now it means like, bling, like jewelry or sparkly things, gold, right? Like shiny objects. So those are just a few examples of words that change over time and across cultures, but particularly across subcultures, not just generations, but subcultures that are created with them. I'm finding it really interesting that right now, Gen Xers, which I'm solidly in the middle of, can I just say, that Gen Xers are building their own culture. Like, hey, we're here. I was like, man, we didn't say a word for 50 years. Now all of a sudden we're having midlife crises and we're like, hey, hey, we're here, guys. Don't forget about us. It kind of makes me laugh on TikTok. If you've ever followed any TikTokers who are talking about Gen X and the way that we were raised and the weirdness about us and all that other stuff, it's kind of become more of a meme than it has really a serious conversation. I'm fine with that. But it is a cultural phenomenon of when we were raised, just like it is when you were raised, and how that impacts your search for the truth, or your interpretation, in this case, of language. So that's denotative, is the generally accepted definitions that we have that we tend to collect in a dictionary, supposedly, which is why you have an urban dictionary, right? Different culture, different meanings of words. And then, of course, the connotative is not just about context, but it's about all of those cultural impacts on your language, on the way that you use it and the way that you see it. So even if it's in the dictionary under a different definition, you may see it differently. How do you understand what the word bad or sick means if you're not paying attention to the cultural impact on that word and its meanings, right? You have to understand what's going on. And that's where the word context comes in. But connotative is a lot more than just contextual definitions. It's bringing all of that together in all of the culture, and all in the specific instance in which you're using the words, in the other words that are around it. Of course, all of that goes into a connotative definition. And Locke really sort of explains that to us, which is awesome. Until he says how he wants to solve these 4 problems in language and solve our problem of denotative and connotative language. And what he says is that we need to purify language. Now, I like John Locke, don't get me wrong, but he's an old dead white guy. And I'm not really sure that we need old dead white guys telling us what words mean exactly, right? Because you can't take into consideration the future changes, the changes that we have to the meanings and the forgive the use of the word, the connotations of language. And so that idea of purifying language means that literally somebody sits there and says, here's what the words are, here's what they mean, and get on board. When I was in school, when I was in grade school, grammar school, whatever you guys call it these days, primary, I don't even know which, elementary, I think you guys call it. When I was in that school, we had to memorize definitions of words. I'm not really sure that they do that these days, because the definitions of words are things that you learn as you go, as opposed to being one set thing. So all due credit to John Locke and his identification of what the problems with language are. I'm not really sure that we agree with his solution. Some of you might, but his solution to those 4 problems is purify language. Make it incredibly streamlined. One word means one thing, and that's it. We would probably be making up a lot of words if that was the case. So that's John Locke. Yes, he did write about social issues, the social contract, and language is part of that social contract, what we agree on. All right. At that point, we have somebody come along who addresses his work specifically to Francis Bacon. He wants to tell Francis Bacon, he says, look, sir, I don't think you're right. So let's talk about the difference between the old reasoning ways of understanding truth and your supposed new methods for understanding truth. Okay? So Vico's work is specifically called On the Study Methods of Our Time. He's talking about, in that moment when he was writing, what were the ways that we studied to find the truth? What were the ways that science worked to find the truth? And he wanted to compare that with the classical Greeks and classical Romans. He said, I'm going to demonstrate how the classical philosophers did this and how we do it. And let's see which one is better. It probably will not surprise you that his conclusion is that the classical way of understanding the world, of creating science, of looking at truth, was the better way to go. Here's why. He believes that what Socrates supposedly said, that the more, or that, a wise man knows that he does not know anything. That's not exactly how it went. It's that a wise person understands that they do not know everything. Okay? Not that they don't know anything, but they don't know everything that there is to know about something. And what that means is that when we know that we don't know, we'll keep asking the question. But what do instruments of science do for us? They give us a feeling of certainty. This is the absolute truth. I know it because I looked at your blood through a microscope, and this is what your blood count is, and this is what diseases you have, and here's what you need to cure it, right? If any of you know anyone who suffers with a chronic illness, I myself do. If any of you know someone who suffers with a chronic illness, is on chemotherapy, is on biologics, they have to have their blood checked almost like every 2 months. Why? Because the science tells us that if we're monitoring the blood closely, we can make sure that there's no negative side effects of the medication, or that the medication is working, or that our disease is in remission, or that it's getting worse, right? And supposedly, these numbers from my blood test tell them all this. And we feel a certain certainty in that. So my doctor calls and says, all right, your blood test came back, you're fine, keep taking the chemotherapy. And, do I ever question that? Not really. Why? Because I also look at the numbers. I'm smarter than the average bear, as you all are. But also, I'm relying on a couple of things. One, that test is accurate. Two, that the science behind it is accurate. And things have changed greatly in science over time. If we didn't keep asking the question, there's certain things that would have never been fixed. Here's an example for you. Me, I'm here right now. I'm not dead. I'm supposed to be dead. Why? Well, I was diagnosed in 2009 with a disease, a chronic illness that they said we have 3 treatments for. We're going to try these 3 treatments and go from there. And we did the first one, and that made my body go into like organ shutdown. That was not good. That was a negative side effect for sure. We tried the second one, no impact, did nothing for me. So we got to the third one. But by the time we got to the third one, about 5 years had passed. And in science's time, that's a lot of time. That if they had said, okay, we've got these 3 treatments and that's it. All right, we're good. We're going to stop looking. We're going to stop bothering learning more about sarcoidosis. If they said, that's it, this is all we needed, I'd be dead because nothing worked, including the 3rd treatment. It worked for like 2 years and then it just quit. Okay. So I had all the symptoms of that disease again. But if they hadn't kept asking the question, how do we solve sarcoidosis? I would be dead because we would have stopped looking for a truth. And that is the big difference between people who say, I did the science, this is the answer, this is the end of it, forget it, we don't need any other explanation, so we can stop looking now. That becomes really problematic. I mean, we've learned a lot, right? Theory of relativity. I believe that has been questioned, if not debunked at this point. Freudian psychology versus Jungian psychology versus Lacanian psychology. 2 of those have been debunked completely, and it's not the one you think. Or it's not the 2 you think. So we accept these things to be truths that are self-evident because we believe that the instruments we've used have told us what we need to know, and that's all we need to know. But in the classical era, when they didn't have an instrument to tell them how far we were from the sun or how hot it was outside or whatnot, we had to continue to question to get the answers as we went along. And so Vico says, that's the way this works. We cannot stop asking questions just because we think we found an instrument to answer the question. So that idea of assumption of certainty, we are certain that this is the answer. He says that is the problem with modern science. Of course, he was talking in the 1800s, I believe. So, not exactly or earlier than that, earlier than the 1800s, 1600s, I believe, something like that. So we really, he was limited in the quote unquote instruments of science that they had. We think we're better now, right? And of course we are. Of course we can see more, we can observe more, we have more tests done, we have more studies done. We know more than we did back then. But if we stop asking the question, that is when we are in trouble. And that goes again back to Socrates. So he says he has this debate, classical way, modern way of doing science, and he said, and finding the truth, and he says the classical way is the only way to go. Next up, how long have I been talking? 40 minutes. Oh wow, not as bad as I thought. Seriously, not as bad as I thought. So then we move into for this week. We move into the new rhetoric, what we call the new rhetoric. All right, so bear with me here. We just spent the Dark Ages saying rhetoric is terrible. We spent the Renaissances saying, well, rhetoric is just fluffy language, it's just pretty, it doesn't really say anything. And other people saying, no, rhetoric is a way of expressing reasoning and therefore telling the truth. And that debate's going on. And so we don't have a definition for rhetoric at this point that is really solidified in the culture. Instead, we have this view of it as being some amorphous thing that doesn't explain anything. It's kind of like when I tell people I study communication, and they're like, well, what does that entail? And I said, the process of how we communicate. And they say, well, couldn't that be in any department on campus? And I was like, yeah, it could be. But not because I know everything about every department on campus. I clearly don't. But because the way in which we communicate information is important. So what ends up happening is we get into the 19th century and we have an establishment of what was called the new rhetoric, which shockingly looks like the old rhetoric. So we went back to rhetoric includes ethos, pathos, logos, the 5 canons. It's about the way that the classical philosophers dealt with rhetoric. That is the new rhetoric. Okay, so rhetoric was this concept about discovering the truth, a means for knowing all the a skill set for knowing all the means of persuasion, of understanding power relationships, of what's going on, and then it became no, it's useless. It's just this fluffy, pretty thing over here, and now we're going back to saying no, it's meaningful. Rhetoric is about meaning. So let's start with Whately on this one. Whately writes about rhetoric in a very specific context. That specific context is the courtroom. So Whately came up with a couple of ideas for a courtroom. Now remember, he's basing this on the British system because that's where he's from. We have changed it just a little bit, modified it just a little bit. There are 2 concepts that are desperately important in the courtroom because they impact the arguments that are made, how those arguments are reasoned out, and what conclusion, in our case, a jury of 12 people might come to, or a judge, or the lawyers, okay? So those 2 concepts are presumption and burden of proof. Now, you'll notice I did not say presumption of innocence. I'm going to explain that. When Whately was writing this, he said very clearly that it was just presumption. Presumption, the idea that what we assume to be true is the baseline for the start of our argument. Okay, so we all agree that this is true. That's presumption. We presume something to be true. All right. In the American court system, we took that idea of presumption and said, presumption is always of innocence. You do, and if you've ever seen some of the court, I'm going to say practices in Australia, in Great Britain specifically, which are the 2 I know the most about other than the US, they actually do not have a presumption of innocence. And sometimes it seems like they have a presumption of guilt. And I know sometimes in America it seems that way too, but in those systems, they actually function where presumptions shifts back and forth between guilt and innocence. It doesn't rely or lay in innocence alone. Whereas in our court system, you are supposed to be presumed innocent. Okay? How do you get over those presumptions, be it in our system or in the system that Wheatley was writing in? And the answer to that is by proving it to be untrue. So you're proving the presumption to be untrue. In doing that, what you're doing is answering the burden of proving presumption wrong. Okay? So burden of proof is not just you have this much evidence, but it's about being able to overcome presumption, which is why sometimes in our court system we question why juries came to the conclusions that they did. If you really go back and look at the O.J. Simpson case or at the Casey Anthony case, if you go with a presumption of innocence in the beginning, there's just not enough proof to overcome that presumption. Whereas in our minds, it may be the complete opposite. I mean, personally, I don't know what the other explanations are for how Casey Anthony's daughter died or how O.J. Simpson's wife died. I just don't know. But I wasn't on the jury. And so I wasn't there and exposed to all of the things that were occurring in the courtroom. I did not have to assume or make the presumption of innocence going into the courtroom. That was not my job. So I look at it very differently. And once you understand that concept, you're more likely to understand why some of the conclusions that come out of court cases are what they are. If you followed the Lori Vallow Daybell case, the cult mom case up in Idaho recently, you saw that basically there was the presumption of innocence, but it was gone very quickly. The jury didn't really deliberate that long because they just didn't give enough to overcome that presumption, or because the DA, the district attorney, and the prosecution provided so much evidence and met that burden so well that the defense didn't really have an answer to it. And so presumption goes away. She's clearly been proven to be guilty. Okay, that was not a hard one to call, by the way, either. But I don't know if you guys follow those court cases. Right now, I'm following Koberger, and I'm also following another case that you probably have never heard of out of Georgia. Why do I follow these things? I don't know. I have a true crime problem. I don't know if any of you have a true crime problem where you listen to podcasts at night about murder and maiming and suddenly fall asleep. That is the way that I fall asleep every night. So also my father was a lawyer, so I learned a lot about the court system, and I like to follow it and pretend that I'm a lawyer, how we do that. So really what Whately gave us was this concept of the stasis point, you've heard me say that before, between guilt and innocence. And he really says this is how that goes back and forth until we determine what the proof shows us about the truth of this matter. That goes back to Aristotle, of course, because stasis is the point where rhetoric begins. Okay, so if you're questioning that, go back and read or watch one of my older lectures, particularly about Aristotle and the definition of rhetoric, and that should help clarify that. If not, let me know. I will answer it. Next up, I'm going to talk a little bit about I.A. Richards. I.A. Richards was known for also being sort of a strange man, but in a cool way. He was a cool guy. I think they called him the White Wolf or something because he always wore this white shaggy coat. I don't know. Something along those lines. He has some interesting stories. But what we're most interested in is that I.A. Richards sort of took John Locke's ideas and put them into a way that we might understand a little bit better. What I mean by that is I.A. Richards has the semantic triangle of meaning. I believe that there's a diagram of it in your book. It is a triangle. So you have got three main points. Those three main points are symbol, reference, and referent. And the way that those could be translated is that the symbol is the word or the sign or the image, if you will. The reference is that way that we think about the word, the symbol, the picture, okay? And then the referent is the actual object or thing or idea that you're referring to. Okay? So if I say to you the word dog, what immediately comes to mind? Some of you might be thinking slobbery, furry, warm friend, scary as all get out, strange animal, four-legged animal. All these things might come to you. Some of you might be thinking the dog that's sitting next to me right now. I don't have a dog, but I mean you. Or the dog that you were raised with. Or a specific name, like, Pookie. Or, I don't know, what else do we name? Bella. Whatever we're naming dogs these days. For me, I don't understand why when I say dog, you don't picture a 76-pound Collie Labrador Dalmatian who has the body of a Dalmatian, the fur of the Labrador, boxed Labrador ears, a Collie nose, and brown Dalmatian spots everywhere that he has white on his body. Why are you not picturing that? Because for you, my dog Corky, when I was growing up, you have no point of reference for that. The only thing you know is what you think of when I say the word dog. And so we have a relationship between the symbol and the reference, between the symbol and the thing that you think about that, what your point of reference is for that thing. It's solid. We know what that is. It's standard. It's not going to change. It's exactly what it is. If I show you an object and say, here's how we think about it, that's solid for you as well. You know exactly how you think about that object that you're seeing, that referent. So those are solid relationships that can't be challenged. Where does the abstraction come in? Between the word or the symbol and its referent. So it seems strange that that would be where the abstraction would be, but we assign the meaning of things to a word and we assign it to an object or to an idea or a concept. And when it's concrete, like a dog, that's something we can get around. We can sort of describe it until we all understand exactly what we're talking about. But if it's a concept that's a little bit more abstract, like, I don't know, love, peace, justice, war, whatever, any of those concepts or ideas, those are big ones, and generally, or I don't feel well, how is it that we express that except through symbols? And if the relationship between the symbol and the referent is arbitrary, abstract, unclear, then that is where communication fails, according to I.A. Richards. He was not interested in communication. I.A. Richards was interested in miscommunication. Why do we miscommunicate? How do we miscommunicate? How do those 4 problems that Locke talks about mess up our ability to communicate? So that's where he says it's the triangle of meaning, because we're trying not to understand definitions, but we're trying to understand the meaning behind symbols. He also has a similar recommendation for how we should fix this problem, and it is also a purification process. I believe at one point he says that the normal average everyday person could have 1,400 words maybe. I think your book tells you, and then the creative writer could have like 2,400. I don't know, some crazy numbers where it's like, this is how many words you get. And the definitions for those. That's it. That's all you get to work with. Sounds a little radical to me, but also sounds like someone who doesn't take that impact of culture into how we interpret symbols and what the meaning of them truly is. Okay, next up, we move on to a very expansive writer named Kenneth Burke. I believe what I'm going to do is stop this video here because we're almost at an hour, and I'm going to pick up with Kenneth Burke later this week. Probably the biggest reason for that is because as you can read the Kenneth Burke, you've got like 3 things to read from Kenneth Burke. It's a lot, and perhaps reading it first is better than reading it after. I'm not really sure, but I want to take my time with Kenneth Burke. So when we come back again and meet like this, I will continue on with this week's readings and this week's lectures. If there are any questions or problems or concerns, please let me know. And if your grade is not up for either your paper or your test by Friday at noon, that's how long I'm going to give it. If it's not up by Friday at noon, please let me know. It should be up. In addition, I'm going to make sure that you have everything that you need for your second paper. And your second paper is not due until August 4th. Okay? So your second paper is due August 4th at 11:59 p.m. I will put that up on the schedule on Blackboard. I'll give you a place to submit it again. I'll make sure that you know that you have the rubric there for you. I'll give you the assignment in more detail as I need to. I believe that I have a video on how to do the second paper. And also, please be assured that you will also get a review and a quiz for your second test as well. But we don't need to worry about that for a couple weeks. So happy reading, continue to read, and we'll be in touch.